There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, moments that you only recognize as the hinges of your entire existence in retrospect. They don't announce themselves with thunder or lightning, but with the quiet click of a lock or the soft weight of a hand. For me, that moment smelled of lavender-scented laundry detergent and the faint, citrusy trace of Julian's shampoo. It was 3 in the morning, and the only light in my apartment came from the indifferent orange glow of a street lamp filtering through the blinds, casting the living room in stripes of shadow and muted gold. He was asleep on my couch, a place he had occupied more nights than not over the past several months. But this time was different. This time, in his sleep, he had shifted, rolling toward the back of the couch where I sat on the floor, my own back pressed against the cushions, and had thrown an arm over my shoulder. It was a dead weight, a purely unconscious gesture, and yet it felt like the most intentional thing that had ever happened to me. I sat there, not daring to breathe, my heart a frantic, trapped bird against my ribs. My world, which had felt so sprawling and uncertain, had suddenly shrunk to the 5 points of contact where his hand rested on my collarbone. It was just a hand. It was just a sleeping friend. But in the profound silence of that night, it felt like an anchor, and I was terrified that if I moved, I would either break it or be dragged down into depths from which I'd never recover. To understand the weight of that arm, you have to understand the architecture of the life I had built before Julian found a way to start leaving doors ajar. I had moved to the city 2 years prior with the express purpose of starting over. My previous life felt like a photograph that had been overexposed, all the details bleached out by a relationship that ended in a blinding flash of betrayal and a career in photojournalism that had left me with a permanent ache of vicarious trauma. I was tired, not just physically, but in my soul. I wanted a life that was quiet, contained, and predictable. I found a small, unassuming apartment in a neighborhood known more for its old trees than its nightlife, and I traded in the grid of conflict zones for the polished surfaces of the corporate world. I became a freelance photographer specializing in headshots and branding content. It was sterile, yes, but it was safe. My subjects came in, I made them look competent and approachable. They left, and I was paid. There were no emotional entanglements, no stories that followed me home and haunted my sleep. I was building a fortress, and its walls were made of professional distance and polite, shallow interactions. Julian was one of my first clients in that new life. He was a consultant for a tech firm, a job that seemed to involve a lot of flying, a lot of confident smiling in boardrooms, and a lot of translating complex code into language that executives could understand. He arrived at my small studio space late, flustered, apologizing profusely. He'd just gotten off a red-eye from San Francisco, and his suit looked like it had been through a battle. He was all kinetic energy and apologies, his hands moving as he spoke, his dark hair falling into his eyes. He had a smile that was a little crooked and instantly disarming. Most of my clients were stiff, self-conscious, and desperate to project an image of success. Julian just looked tired and genuinely sorry for being a nuisance. I remember telling him to take a minute, offering him a bottle of water. He sank onto the stool in front of the seamless paper backdrop and let out a sigh that seemed to deflate his entire body. He looked at me, really looked at me, and said, "Do you ever feel like you're just a collection of time zones and airline loyalty points?" It was such an unguarded question, so out of place in the sterile environment I had so carefully curated. It was a crack in the wall. That was the beginning. The photo shoot itself was easy. He was naturally photogenic, but more than that, he was responsive. I didn't have to coax a personality out of him. It was right there on the surface, bright and engaging. But beneath it, I could see the flicker of exhaustion, the same kind of bone-deep weariness I was so familiar with. We talked as I worked, the conversation flowing easily from his travel nightmares to my reasons for switching from photojournalism to this. I gave him the sanitized version, of course, the version about wanting a better work-life balance. He nodded, but his eyes held a knowing sort of sympathy, as if he could see the redacted lines in my story. When we were done, he lingered. He looked at some of my personal work I had framed on the walls, stark, black and white landscapes, lonely and atmospheric. He didn't say much, just traced the line of a barren tree with his eyes. "You're good at finding the quiet," he said, finally. And in that moment, I felt seen in a way I hadn't allowed myself to be in years. Our friendship grew from there, organically, like a vine finding its way through the cracks in a sidewalk. It was a friendship built on weeknight takeout and bad movies, on text messages sent from airport lounges and hotel rooms across the country. He was the outgoing one, the one who would drag me to a new brewery or a street festival, pulling me gently out of the fortress I was so committed to maintaining. I was the quiet one, the steady presence he would return to after his whirlwind trips, the person he could sit with in comfortable silence. He had a long-term girlfriend then, Chloe, a sharp, ambitious lawyer who seemed to exist in the same high-stakes, high-energy world that he did. I met her a few times. She was perfectly nice, perfectly polished, and I always felt like a piece of rustic, unsanded furniture in her presence. They were a power couple, their lives a whirlwind of social engagements and career moves. When they were together, Julian seemed to vibrate at a higher frequency, brighter but also more brittle. When he was with me, the frequency would drop, the frantic energy would dissipate, and he would settle, like dust in a quiet room. I knew, probably within the first 6 months of our friendship, that my feelings for him had crossed a line. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic realization. It was more like the slow development of a photograph in a darkroom. The image was always there, latent in the paper, but it took time and the right chemical conditions for it to emerge. It was in the way my stomach would tighten when he'd text landed, the way I'd find myself cleaning my apartment before he was due to come over, the way I'd hold onto the casual, friendly hugs he gave a little too long. I was a quiet observer by nature and by trade, and I turned that observational focus onto him with an intensity that was almost painful. I cataloged the way his eyes would crinkle at the corners when he truly laughed, the specific cadence of his footsteps on the stairs to my apartment, the way he would run a hand through his hair when he was stressed. I was falling in love with him in 1,000 tiny, unprovable details. And I buried it. I buried it deep, under layers of casual banter and platonic affection. He was my friend. He was my only real friend in this new, quiet life. He was straight. He was in a relationship. The walls of my fortress had been breached by his friendship, and I was terrified that if I confessed the truth of my feelings, I would not only be rejected, but I would be left completely alone again, this time in a ruin of my own making. So I became an expert in self-censorship, a curator of my own heart, carefully selecting which feelings were safe to display and which had to remain in storage, locked away in the dark. The shift, when it came, was not a gentle tremor but an earthquake. It happened on a Tuesday night in October. The air had turned crisp, and the leaves on the trees outside my window were a riot of yellow and orange. I was editing a set of photos when my phone buzzed with a call from Julian. It was unusual. He was a texter, not a caller, unless it was an emergency. I answered, and all he said was my name. Leo. His voice was wrecked, a raw, hollowed-out sound that I had never heard before. It was the voice of someone who had been scraped clean from the inside. "Can I come over?" he asked, and it wasn't a question so much as a plea. He didn't need to say anything else. I told him of course, and 20 minutes later he was at my door. He looked like the physical embodiment of that sound. His face was pale and blotchy, his eyes were red-rimmed, and his usually impeccable clothes were rumpled. He didn't even seem to be fully inhabiting his own body. He walked in without a word and just stood in the middle of my living room, his shoulders slumped. "Chloe and I, we're done," he said, the words barely audible. It's over." He didn't offer details, and I didn't ask for them. The how and why didn't matter. What mattered was the man standing in front of me, looking like a building that had just had its foundation ripped out from under it. All that bright, kinetic energy was gone, replaced by a profound and shocking stillness. I did the only thing I could think to do. I walked over to him, put my hands on his shoulders, and guided him to the couch. He sank into it like a stone. I made him tea, which he held in his hands without drinking, just staring into the steam as if it held some kind of answer. We sat there in silence for what felt like hours. The quiet that had once been a comfortable space between us was now filled with his grief. I just sat with him, a silent sentinel, letting my presence be a container for his pain. I didn't offer platitudes or advice. My own history with heartbreak had taught me that there is nothing to say. There is only the grim business of surviving the initial impact. Eventually, his head drooped and his eyes fluttered shut. He was exhausted on a cellular level. "You should sleep," I said softly. He just nodded, his eyes still closed. Can I just stay here? On the couch?" he mumbled. "I don't think I can be in my apartment. Her stuff is everywhere." "Of course," I said. "Stay as long as you need." I got him a pillow and a blanket from my linen closet. As I draped the blanket over him, his hand shot out and grabbed my wrist. His grip was surprisingly strong. "Don't go yet," he whispered, his eyes still closed. "Just for a minute." So I sat on the floor, my back against the couch, just as I would so many months later on that fateful night. I sat there until his breathing evened out and his grip on my wrist loosened. That night, a new dynamic was established. My apartment was no longer just a friendly port of call. It had become a sanctuary, and I, the quiet observer, had become its keeper. That first night bled into a week, and that week bled into a month. The ritual began subtly, an unspoken arrangement born of his need and my inability to deny him anything. He would go to his own apartment to shower and change for work, but most evenings he would end up back at my place. It started with him just falling asleep on the couch, fully clothed, exhausted from the emotional toll of the breakup and the logistics of disentangling a life that had been woven together with someone else's for 5 years. He was a ghost haunting his own life, and my small, quiet apartment was the only place he seemed to feel solid. I would come out in the morning and find him there, curled up under the blanket I'd given him, looking younger and more vulnerable than he ever did in the daylight. I'd make coffee, and we would drink it in near silence, the morning light slowly filling the room, before he would pull himself together and head out into the world to put on his mask of competence and charm. I told myself it was temporary. He was grieving. He was lonely. He just needed a friend. I was careful to keep a certain physical distance, to respect the boundaries of his pain. I was the nurse, the caretaker, the stoic friend. But inside, a quiet, treacherous hope began to grow. I was getting to see a version of Julian that no one else did. Not the charismatic consultant, not Chloe's ambitious partner, but the man who was lost and hurting and who, for some reason, had chosen me to be his anchor. My apartment became his safe harbor, and the couch was his mooring. The space between us, once a comfortable platonic distance, was now charged with a new kind of intimacy, the intimacy of shared vulnerability. I would sit on the floor and work on my laptop while he slept, the sound of his steady breathing a new kind of soundtrack to my life. I was acutely aware of him, of his presence filling my space. The air itself felt different, heavier, suffused with him. I was living in a state of suspended animation, caught between the profound tenderness I felt for him and the sharp, constant fear of what it all meant. The ritual began to escalate, slowly, almost imperceptibly. The couch was not comfortable for someone of his height, and he started waking up with a stiff back. One evening, after a particularly long day of him sorting through boxes of shared belongings at his old place, he came back to my apartment looking utterly defeated. We were watching some mindless action movie, a distraction from the quiet hum of his misery. He was sitting at one end of the couch, and I was at the other. Midway through the film, he shifted, then shifted again. Finally, with a sigh, he lay down, resting his head on the armrest. A few minutes later, he shifted again, and then his head was in my lap. He didn't say a word. He just settled there, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. My entire body went rigid. I could feel the warmth of his scalp through the thin fabric of my jeans. I could smell his shampoo. My hand, which had been resting on the cushion beside me, was now suspended in the air, unsure of where to land. Should I touch his hair? Should I just let my hand rest on his shoulder? Every option felt like a monumental decision. After a long, agonizing moment, I simply placed my hand on the couch next to his head, my fingers just inches from his hair. It was a compromise, an act of supreme restraint. He let out a soft sigh and seemed to relax even further. My heart was a drum against my ribs, but I forced myself to sit perfectly still, to breathe evenly, to pretend that this was normal. We stayed like that for the rest of the movie, and long after the credits rolled. He had fallen asleep, his breathing soft and even. And I just sat there, trapped in a state of exquisite torture, my lap a cradle for the man I loved. This became the new normal. Movie nights meant Julian's head in my lap. He would claim it was just more comfortable, and I would agree, and we would both participate in this silent, shared fiction. We were just friends. This was just what friends did when one of them was going through a hard time. But I knew better. I knew that every time he settled against me, it was a choice. And every time I allowed it, it was a choice. We were building a new language together, a language of touch and proximity, where all the most important things were left unsaid. My internal monologue during those evenings was a frantic, chaotic thing. I would analyze the pressure of his head, the way his hair felt when it accidentally brushed against my hand, the slight shifts in his breathing. I was a seismologist monitoring a fault line, constantly measuring the tiny tremors, waiting for the big one. Part of me was terrified. I was becoming accustomed to his presence, to this specific, fragile form of intimacy. I was building my life around it, arranging my evenings in anticipation of his arrival. I knew that when he finally healed, when he no longer needed this comfort, he would leave. The ritual would end, and I would be left in a silence that was no longer comfortable, but empty. The other part of me, the hopeful, foolish part, wondered if this was not an ending for him, but a beginning for us. Perhaps this was his way of slowly, cautiously, finding his way to me. The plausible deniability of the couch began to wear thin. Winter arrived, and with it came the first real cold snap of the year. One night, Julian called me from his apartment. "My heat is broken," he said, his teeth chattering theatrically. "The landlord says it'll be 2 days before they can get the part. I'm going to freeze to death. Can I invade your sanctuary?" I laughed, the sound a little too shaky. "Of course," I said. "The couch is waiting." But when he arrived, shivering and bundled in a huge coat, he looked at the couch with a new kind of trepidation. "You know," he said, his voice casual, a little too casual, "I think my back is permanently bent into a couch shape. You don't have, like, an air mattress or something, do you?" My heart stopped. I didn't own an air mattress. I had a queen-sized bed. That was the only other option. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken possibilities. I felt like we were standing on opposite sides of a door, and he had just asked me to open it. "I don't," I said, my voice carefully neutral. "But the bed is big enough for 2. If you don't mind." He looked at me, his gaze searching. I held his eyes, trying to project an aura of calm, of casual friendliness. I was an actor in the most important performance of my life. "Yeah? You sure?" he asked. "I don't want to intrude." "It's fine, Julian," I said, turning away to busy myself with something in the kitchen, needing to break the intensity of his gaze. "It's just sleeping. Better than the floor." "Okay," he said softly. "Thanks, Leo." That night was the first time he slept in my bed. It was an exercise in mutual, agonizing awareness. We lay on opposite sides of the mattress, a vast, arctic expanse of cotton sheets between us, both of us pretending to be asleep. I lay on my side, facing away from him, my body rigid, my senses on high alert. I was aware of every shift of his weight, every breath he took. The air in the room was electric. It was no longer just about comfort. It was about proximity. We were sharing the most intimate of domestic spaces, and the pretext of a broken heater felt like the thinnest, most transparent veil. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just lay there, listening to him breathe, feeling the heat of his body across the inches that separated us. I felt like a cartographer mapping a new and dangerous territory, a land of unspoken desires and terrifying possibilities. His heater was fixed 2 days later, but the precedent had been set. The door had been opened, and it was never fully closed again. A few weeks later, he had an early flight. "My alarm is notoriously unreliable," he said, with that same feigned casualness. "I know you're an early riser." Mind if I crash at your place so you can make sure I get up? And so he was back in my bed. Then it was a late night working on a project. Then it was just because he was too tired to drive home. The reasons became flimsier and flimsier, until eventually, there were no reasons at all. He would just stay, and it was understood that he would end up in my bed. We developed a silent choreography. I would get ready for bed first, and then he would come in, and we would take our respective sides. We never touched. We maintained the careful fiction of the space between us. But the space was shrinking. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I would wake up and he would have rolled closer, his arm thrown over the pillow next to my head, or his leg brushing against mine. In those moments, I would lie perfectly still, my heart pounding, caught between the desire to lean into the touch and the fear of startling him, of breaking the spell. This ritual became the center of my existence. My life was divided into two distinct states: the quiet, gray hours when Julian was not there, and the vibrant, terrifying, beautiful hours when he was. I lived for the evenings. I found myself photographing less, my own creative world paling in comparison to the complex, unfolding drama of my life. My focus had narrowed to him, to the four walls of my apartment, to the silent language we were speaking in the dark. I was in a constant state of low-grade anxiety and soaring hope. I was so afraid of misinterpreting the signals, of projecting my own desires onto his actions. Was this just what he needed to heal? Was I just a convenient, warm body, a placeholder until he was ready to move on? Or was this something more? Was he, in his own confused, unspoken way, choosing me? I had no way of knowing, and I was too afraid to ask, too afraid to shatter the fragile, beautiful thing we were building, whatever it was. He was the unknowing initiator, constantly pushing the boundaries, and I was the quiet observer, constantly trying to interpret the data, to find a pattern in the chaos. We were two celestial bodies, drawn into a strange and powerful orbit, both of us unsure of the laws of physics that were governing us. The night everything changed started like any other. It was a Thursday in late spring. The windows were open, and the scent of rain-washed pavement and blooming jasmine drifted into the apartment. Julian had come over straight from the airport after a 3-day trip to Chicago. He looked worn out, the travel having sanded down his usual protective layer of energy. We didn't even bother with a movie. We ate dinner, and then he just looked at me and said, "I'm so tired I think my bones are asleep." He went to take a shower, and I went to my room to get ready for bed. I was lying there, reading a book, when he came in. He was wearing a pair of my gray sweatpants and an old t-shirt, clothes he now kept in a drawer in my dresser. The sight of his clothes commingling with mine was a constant, quiet shock to my system. He didn't get into his side of the bed. He just stood there, by the door, for a long moment, looking at me. The street lamp outside cast a familiar pattern of light and shadow across his face. "Leo," he said. His voice was quiet, tentative. "Yeah." I put my book down, my entire being focused on him. He walked over to the bed and sat on the edge, near my feet. He didn't look at me. He just stared at his hands, which were clasped between his knees. The silence in the room was different tonight. It wasn't the comfortable silence of companionship or the tense silence of unspoken desire. It was heavy, like the air before a storm. "I'm not tired," he said finally. I waited. I am, he corrected himself, with a small, humorless laugh. "I am tired, but that's not why I'm here. It hasn't been for a long time." My breath caught in my throat. This was it, the moment of truth. The ground I had been so carefully navigating for months was beginning to crack beneath my feet. I didn't say anything. I just watched him, my heart a frantic, painful rhythm against my ribs. He finally lifted his head and looked at me. His eyes were dark and filled with a kind of desperate vulnerability I had never seen in him before, not even in the depths of his breakup. It was the look of someone standing on a cliff, about to jump. "Would it be okay?" he began, his voice barely a whisper, so quiet I almost wasn't sure I'd heard it. He swallowed, then started again. "Would it be okay if I kissed you?" The question hung in the air between us, a fragile, shimmering thing. It was everything I had ever wanted to hear and everything I was terrified of. It was a confession, a plea, and a terrifying risk, all wrapped up in 7 simple words. In that moment, all the months of analysis, of fear, of hope, coalesced into a single point of blinding clarity. All the unspoken questions, all the ambiguous gestures, all the nights of feigned sleep and careful distance, it had all been leading here. To this question, to this choice. I could have said no. I could have pretended I didn't understand. I could have made a joke and broken the tension, preserving the friendship, preserving the fragile safety of our status quo. But I was so tired of being safe. I was so tired of living in the quiet, empty spaces of my own fortress. I didn't answer him with words. I just nodded. A single, slow, deliberate nod. His eyes searched mine for a fraction of a second, as if to confirm what he was seeing. And then he moved. He crawled up the length of the bed, the mattress dipping with his weight. He moved with a kind of reverence, a slowness that spoke volumes. He knelt in front of me, his knees on either side of my legs. He cupped my face in his hands, his palms warm against my skin. His thumbs gently stroked my cheekbones. He was still looking at me, his gaze so intense it felt like he was seeing every secret I had ever kept. And then, he leaned in and kissed me. It was not a passionate kiss, not a kiss of pent-up, frantic desire. It was the softest, most tentative kiss I had ever known. It was a question. It was a confession. It was an apology. It was hello. His lips were soft, and they tasted faintly of the mint from his toothpaste. It lasted only a moment, and then he pulled back, just an inch, his forehead resting against mine. His eyes were closed. "Okay," he whispered, his breath warm against my lips. "Okay," I whispered back, my voice thick with emotion. He kissed me again, and this time it was deeper, more certain. It was a kiss of relief, of arrival. All the anxiety, all the tension that had been coiling inside me for months, finally unspooled. I brought my hands up and tangled them in his hair, the hair I had spent so many nights wanting to touch. I pulled him closer, and he made a soft sound in the back of his throat, a sound of surrender. We were no longer on opposite sides of the bed, separated by a chasm of unspoken feelings. We were here, in the center, in a space we had finally, terrifyingly, created together. The line had been crossed. The door had been opened. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what was on the other side. The aftermath was not the gentle dawn I had envisioned. It was a stark and silent morning. I woke up slowly, coming to consciousness with a feeling of profound peace, a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun streaming through the window. I reached out, my hands searching for the solid presence that should have been next to me. The sheets were cold. I opened my eyes. The other side of the bed was empty, the pillow still bearing the faint indentation of his head. A knot of ice formed in my stomach. I sat up, listening. The apartment was silent. Not the comfortable, lived-in silence of two people sharing a space, but the hollow, echoing silence of being alone. I called his name. Julian. Nothing. I got out of bed and walked into the living room. His shoes were gone from by the door. His jacket was gone from the back of the chair. The coffee mugs from the night before were still on the counter, a silent testament to a moment that now felt like a dream. He was gone. I checked my phone, my hand trembling slightly. There was one new message. From him. I opened it, my heart pounding with a sick, familiar dread. The message was short, brutal in its efficiency. "Leo, I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have done that. I'm confused. I need some space." I read the words once, then twice, then a third time, as if staring at them long enough would change their meaning. Confused. Need some space. The words were like stones, cold and heavy in my gut. All the warmth, all the certainty of the night before, evaporated, leaving behind a chilling fog of doubt and humiliation. I had been wrong. I had misread everything. The months of intimacy, the shared vulnerability, the head in my lap, the nights in my bed, the final, desperate question. I had built a cathedral of meaning out of what, for him, was just a moment of confusion. A mistake. A drunken impulse without the alcohol. I felt like a fool. The quiet observer had been so focused on interpreting the data that he had missed the most obvious conclusion. He was seeing what he wanted to see. I had allowed myself to hope, and the universe, in its cruel efficiency, had punished me for it. I sank onto the couch, the same couch where this whole agonizing ritual had begun, and I felt the walls of my fortress, the ones I had so carefully built, begin to reassemble themselves around me, brick by painful brick. The week that followed was one of the longest of my life. The silence from Julian was absolute. No texts, no calls. The quiet in my apartment was no longer a comfort. It was an accusation. Every empty space seemed to shout his absence. The other side of the bed, the empty spot on the couch, the drawer that still held his clothes. I avoided my bedroom as much as possible, sleeping on the couch myself, as if punishing my body for its memory of his warmth. I tried to work, but I couldn't focus. The faces in my photographs looked blank, their smiles hollow. I felt a familiar loneliness creeping back in, but this time it was sharper, laced with the bitterness of a specific, personal loss. It wasn't just the absence of a potential lover, it was the absence of my best friend. In his confusion, he had taken both from me, leaving a void that felt twice as large. I oscillated between anger and a deep, aching sadness. I was angry at him for his cowardice, for initiating something so profound only to run from it, like a frightened child, for making me feel like his emotional experiment, for using me as a temporary balm for his own loneliness and then discarding me when it became too real. But beneath the anger was a well of sorrow. I mourned the loss of our easy friendship, the comfortable rhythm of our lives. I missed his laugh. I missed his stupid jokes. I missed the simple, uncomplicated presence of him in my space. And I was terrified that his fear and confusion had permanently broken the most important relationship in my life. I had risked everything for that one hopeful nod, and it seemed I had lost. After 10 days of this torturous silence, something inside me snapped. It was a quiet, internal break. I was sitting on my floor, staring at the striped pattern the blinds made on my wall, and I realized I could not live in this limbo. I could not let him define the narrative of what had happened between us with his fear and his silence. His confusion was his own, but his actions had involved me. I deserved more than a 3-sentence text message. I deserved an explanation. Or at the very least, I deserved to say my piece. The quiet observer had to stop observing and start acting. The fear of confrontation was immense, but the pain of this unresolved silence was greater. I stood up, put on my shoes, and walked out the door. I didn't have a plan. I just knew I had to go to his apartment. I had to face him. I had to trade this hollow silence for any kind of truth, no matter how painful. The walk to his building felt both impossibly long and terrifyingly short. With every step, I rehearsed what I would say, my internal monologue a chaotic jumble of accusations and pleas. By the time I stood in front of his door, I had no speech left. I was just empty and determined. I raised my hand and knocked, the sound echoing in the quiet hallway. I waited. For a moment, I thought he wouldn't answer. I could hear faint movement inside, a shuffling sound. Then, the lock clicked, and the door opened a few inches. He stood there, looking at me through the narrow gap. He looked terrible. He was unshaven, with dark circles under his eyes. He was wearing the same worn-out university sweatshirt he'd had on for years. He looked like he hadn't slept any better than I had. "Leo," he said, his voice rough. He didn't open the door any wider. "We need to talk," I said, my own voice firmer than I expected. "You don't get to do what you did and then disappear. You don't get to send a text message and think that's enough." He winced, and for a second, I thought he might close the door in my face. Instead, he sighed, a sound of pure defeat, and opened it all the way. "Come in," he said, stepping back. His apartment was a mess. There were takeout containers on the coffee table and piles of mail on the counter. It looked like the home of someone who was just passing through, not living. It lacked the warmth and intention of my space, the space he had so willingly inhabited for months. He didn't sit down. He just stood in the middle of the room, his arms crossed over his chest, a defensive posture. "I know," he said, not looking at me. "I'm sorry. For the text. For all of it. I've been an ass. Sorry isn't enough, Julian. I said, the anger finally bubbling to the surface. What was it? What was all of that? The last few months? Was I just convenient? Was I just a warm body to get you through your breakup? Because if that's what it was, you need to look me in the eye and say it. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were filled with a misery that mirrored my own. No, he said, his voice cracking. God, no, Leo. It was never that. You were never that. Then what was it? I demanded, my voice rising. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you used me. You leaned on me. You took all the comfort I had to give. You pushed and you pushed until you got what you wanted, and then you ran away because you got scared. You made me feel. You made me believe. I couldn't finish the sentence. The lump in my throat was too thick. He sank onto his couch, burying his face in his hands. His shoulders shook. I know. He mumbled into his palms. You're right. You're right about all of it. I did get scared. I am scared. I woke up that morning, and you were there, sleeping, and it felt so right. It felt more real than anything I've ever felt in my entire life. And it terrified me. He looked up, his face streaked with tears. It was the second time I had seen him cry, and this time, it felt even more raw, more stripped bare. I've spent my whole life on a path, Leo. The right job, the right girlfriend, the right future. It was all laid out. I knew who I was supposed to be. And then you. Our friendship, this thing between us. It wasn't on the map. It wasn't part of the plan. I'm not a deviation from your plan, Julian, I said, my voice softening despite myself. I'm a person. I know, he whispered. That's what scares me. Because kissing you, being with you that night, it didn't feel like a deviation. It felt like I was finally on the right path for the first time. It felt like coming home. And I have no idea what to do with that. I've never felt this for a man before. I don't know what it means. All I knew was that it was huge, and it was real, and my first instinct was to run away and try to put everything back in the neat little boxes I'm used to. But it doesn't fit. You don't fit. And I destroyed our friendship because I'm a coward, he let out a shaky breath. I miss you. I've been miserable for 10 days. This apartment, it's just a place to sleep. Your apartment was home. You are home. And I ruined it. The dam of my anger broke, washed away by the raw, desperate honesty of his confession. This wasn't the rejection I had feared. This was something far more complicated and far more human. It was fear. The same fear I had lived with for years. The fear of the unknown. The fear of rewriting your own story. He hadn't run from me. He had run from himself. I walked over and sat down next to him on the couch. The space between us was no longer an Arctic expanse, but a place of shared, trembling confession. I didn't touch him. I just sat there, letting the truth of his words settle in the room. You didn't ruin it, I said, after a long silence. It's damaged, but it's not ruined. Nothing is ruined. I took a deep breath, preparing to take my own leap. I've been in love with you for a long time, Julian. I just got very good at hiding it. So if you're scared, that's okay. I get it. I was scared too. I was terrified of losing you. But this silence is worse than any rejection could have been. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a new kind of understanding. You have? He asked, his voice full of wonder. For how long? A while, I said with a small smile. I'm the quiet observer, remember? I notice things. A slow smile spread across his face, the first genuine smile I had seen in what felt like an eternity. It was a little crooked, a little tear-stained, but it was there. So we're both idiots, he said. Basically, I agreed. We're a pair of terrified idiots. He let out a laugh, a real one this time, a sound of pure relief. And then he did something that felt more intimate than any kiss. He reached out and took my hand. He didn't just hold it. He laced his fingers through mine, his grip firm and certain. He looked down at our joined hands, then back up at me. I don't want to be a coward anymore, he said, his voice clear and steady. I don't know what this looks like or where it goes, but I want to find out. With you, if you'll let me. Okay, I said, my own voice thick again, but this time with a hope that felt solid, earned. Okay, we didn't go back to my apartment that night. We stayed at his, and we talked. We talked for hours. laying all the unspoken things out between us. We unraveled the months of ambiguity, replacing subtext with text, assumptions with admissions. It was like developing a photograph that had been taken in near darkness. Slowly, with care and the right chemistry, the true image began to emerge, sharp and clear. He talked about the loneliness he'd felt even when he was with Chloe, a sense of never quite being seen for who he was behind the charming facade. He confessed that my quiet, steady presence had felt like the only real thing in his life for a long time, and his need to be near me had grown into something he couldn't name but couldn't live without. I talked about my own fears, the fortress I had built around my heart, and how his friendship had been the one thing that had managed to find the cracks. We laid our histories and our fears bare, creating a new foundation between us, one built not on pretense or plausible deniability, but on the solid, sometimes scary, ground of truth. That night, we slept in his bed, and when he reached for me in the dark, it wasn't an unconscious gesture. It was an intentional act. He pulled me against his chest and held me, his chin resting on the top of my head. There was no arctic expanse of sheets between us, no feigned sleep, no agonizing analysis. There was just the simple, profound peace of being held. For the first time, in a bed that wasn't mine, in a space that had felt so foreign just hours before, I felt completely and utterly at home. I fell asleep to the steady, reassuring rhythm of his heart beating against my back. The days that followed were a process of gentle realignment. We were learning a new language, one that included words. We were learning how to be together, intentionally. The changes were small, but significant. He started keeping more than just a few items of clothing at my place. He brought his favorite coffee mug over. He bought a ridiculously soft blanket that he claimed was for official movie night cuddling, a joke that held the weight of a promise. My apartment, which had once been my solitary fortress, slowly, organically, became our shared space. The quiet didn't disappear, it transformed. It was no longer the quiet of solitude, but the comfortable, humming quiet of companionship. It was the sound of two people existing in the same space, one reading while the other typed on a laptop, the silence a soft blanket woven from mutual affection. One Saturday morning, a few weeks later, I woke up to the smell of coffee. I opened my eyes and Julian was sitting on the edge of the bed, fully dressed, holding a mug out to me. He had been up for hours. "Morning," he said, his smile easy and bright. I was thinking, my lease is up in 2 months. I took the mug, my heart giving a familiar little lurch. "Oh," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "Yeah," he said, his eyes not leaving mine. "And my apartment is kind of a sad, empty box. And all my favorite stuff is here anyway." He gestured around my room, at his mug in my hand, at the ridiculous blanket pulled at the foot of the bed, at himself. "So, I was wondering, what do you think about making the sanctuary official? Getting rid of the commute?" My throat felt tight. He was asking to move in. It wasn't a desperate plea on a rainy night or a flimsy excuse about an early flight. It was a clear, sunlit question about building a future. "I think," I said, my voice soft, "that I would like that very much." His smile widened, reaching his eyes. He leaned in and kissed me, a slow, sweet morning kiss that tasted of coffee and certainty. It was a kiss that held no questions, only answers. That evening, as we were getting ready for bed, I stopped in the doorway of my bedroom and looked back at him. He was standing in the living room, turning off the lights, the same stripes of orange from the street lamp casting him in shadow and gold. He looked up and saw me watching him. He smiled that crooked, disarming smile that had cracked my fortress from the very first day. He walked over to me, took my hand, and gently pulled me into the room. Then, he reached back and quietly, deliberately, closed the door, shutting out the rest of the world. We were in. Together. The ritual was over, replaced by a life. We had moved past the terror and relief of mutual vulnerability and had arrived, finally, in the quiet peace of a shared emotional harbor. We didn't need the pretense of an open door anymore. We had learned to build our own room, and within its walls, we were safe. We began to heal, not in the silence of things left unsaid, but in the beautiful, honest quiet we had finally learned to create together.